we went to the wrap party that this was it for the Andy Griffith Show.
The night everyone else was laughing, Ron Howard was watching. Years later, he would remember countless wonderful moments from the Andy Griffith Show. He would remember the success, the friendships, the lessons, and the opportunity that launched his career. But hidden among those memories was something far less pleasant. A tension that never seemed to disappear. A feeling that followed him through much of his childhood. To millions of viewers, Mayberry looked like the happiest place on television. It felt safe, warm, familiar. Every week, families gathered around their televisions and watched Sheriff Andy Taylor, Aunt Bee, and little Opie navigate life's challenges with kindness and humor. The chemistry looked effortless. The affection looked genuine. The family looked real. But Ron Howard knew something the audience didn't. Not everyone behind the cameras felt like family. In fact, there was one person he struggled to understand from the very beginning. One person whose presence could change the atmosphere of an entire room without saying a word. Ron didn't have the vocabulary to explain it when he was young. He only knew how it felt. He knew that conversations became awkward. He knew that interactions felt forced. He knew that whenever he found himself around this person, the warmth that existed elsewhere on the set seemed to disappear. At first, he ignored it. Children adapt quickly. They assume adults know what they're doing. But the longer he worked on the show, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. What started as confusion slowly turned into frustration. Then frustration turned into something else. Something deeper. Something that stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The strange thing was that nobody talked openly about it. Not the cast. Not the crew. Not the producers. Everyone seemed aware of the tension, yet nobody addressed it directly. It was as if an invisible rule existed throughout Mayberry. Acknowledge the success, celebrate the ratings, but never discuss what was happening behind the curtain. Ron followed that rule for years. Yet the mystery only grew larger. Why did one relationship feel so different from all the others? Why did one person seem determined to remain separate from everyone around them? And why did even the most patient people on the show seem unable to break through that wall? As Ron grew older, he began noticing details he had missed as a child. The problem wasn't isolated to him. That realization changed everything. If he had been the only person feeling uncomfortable, he might have blamed himself. But he wasn't. Crew members adjusted their behavior depending on who was nearby. Directors chose their words carefully. Conversations sometimes stopped the moment a certain person entered the room. Nobody needed to explain what was happening because everyone could feel it. The atmosphere shifted. The energy changed. The room became smaller somehow. Ron started paying attention. The more he watched, the more he realized that this wasn't the result of one argument or one misunderstanding. It was a pattern stretching across years. A pattern that seemed impossible to break. What made it even more confusing was the contradiction. On screen, this individual represented everything audiences loved about Mayberry. Warmth, stability, compassion, family. Yet off-screen, Ron experienced the exact opposite. Distance, isolation, emotional coldness. Every day he was expected to portray a close family bond, and every day he found himself questioning whether that bond existed at all once filming stopped. The contradiction fascinated him because children are naturally drawn to consistency. They want things to make sense. Ron couldn't make sense of this. How could someone appear so caring on camera and feel so unreachable off camera? Why did every attempt at connection seem to fail? And perhaps most importantly, why did the tension seem to affect Andy Griffith as much as it affected everyone else? That was the detail Ron couldn't ignore. Andy Griffith was the center of the show. The leader. The peacemaker. If anyone could bring people together, it was him. Yet even Griffith appeared unable to solve the problem. Watching that unfold convinced Ron that something bigger was happening beneath the surface. Something nobody fully understood. Something that had been quietly shaping life inside Mayberry for years. The turning point came when Ron stopped expecting things to improve. That sounds simple, but for a child, it's a major realization. Children naturally believe adults will eventually fix problems. They assume tension will disappear. They assume misunderstandings will be resolved. Ron spent years waiting for that resolution. It never came. Instead, the distance remained exactly where it had always been. During filming, he learned to work around it. He learned to smile when the scene required it. He learned to deliver performances that convinced audiences everything was perfect. Yet privately, his frustration continued growing. One famous example involved the now legendary Pickle episode. Viewers remember it as a harmless comedy moment. Ron remembered something else. He hated pickles. Multiple takes meant repeatedly eating something he couldn't stand. Under normal circumstances, it would have become nothing more than a funny story. Instead, it became linked to a broader feeling of discomfort because it happened within an environment that already felt emotionally exhausting. The scene itself wasn't the issue. The atmosphere was. Looking back, Ron later acknowledged that this cast member was never among his favorite people to work with. Coming from Howard, that's significant. Throughout his career, he developed a reputation for diplomacy. He rarely criticized colleagues. He rarely engaged in public feuds. Yet even he couldn't completely hide the reality of what those years felt like. What bothered him most wasn't hostility. Hostility can be confronted. Hostility can be discussed. Emotional distance is harder. It leaves questions hanging in the air. Questions without answers. Why was this person so different from everyone else? Why did every interaction feel guarded? Why did every attempt at connection seem doomed from the beginning? Those questions followed Ron for years. Then something happened that completely changed the way he viewed the situation. Not immediately.
Not during production. Much later. Long after Mayberry had become television history. Long after Ron Howard had become one of Hollywood's biggest directors. Long after everyone assumed the story was over. Years later, information emerged that forced Ron to reconsider everything he thought he knew. Suddenly, the behavior that had frustrated him for so long looked different. Not justified. Different. The emotional wall he remembered wasn't simply a wall. It was a shield. The coldness wasn't necessarily rejection. It might have been fear. The distance wasn't necessarily personal. It might have been loneliness. For the first time, Ron began seeing the situation through a completely different lens. And then came the revelation nobody expected. After years of tension, years of misunderstanding, and years of emotional separation, the person at the center of the conflict finally acknowledged what had happened. A private confession. A deeply personal admission. Words that Andy Griffith never expected to hear. Words that would eventually reshape how Ron remembered much of his childhood on the show. In a single moment, the villain of the story became something far more complicated. And that realization created an entirely new mystery. If everyone had misunderstood this person for years, what else had they misunderstood? What truths had remained hidden beneath the surface of television's happiest town? And what exactly did that shocking confession reveal about the relationship that had troubled Ron Howard for most of his time in Mayberry? That answer would force him to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered before, that the person he spent years resenting may have been carrying a burden far heavier than anyone around them ever realized. The phone call came years too late to change the past, but it arrived just in time to change how Ron Howard understood it. By then, he wasn't little Opie anymore. He wasn't the confused child trying to figure out why one person on the set always seemed distant. He wasn't the young actor wondering why every interaction felt colder than it should. He was an adult. A filmmaker. A man who had spent decades working with actors, directors, producers, and personalities from every corner of Hollywood. Experience had taught him something important: people are rarely as simple as they appear. The difficult ones often carry invisible wounds. The friendly ones sometimes hide darker truths. The public version of a person and the private version are often worlds apart. Yet even with all that experience, Ron wasn't prepared for what he would eventually learn. For years, he had viewed the tension through the eyes of the child who experienced it. The child saw distance. The child felt rejection. The child assumed the problem was personal. But adulthood brought a different perspective. It forced him to revisit old memories with new questions. What if the coldness had never been about him? What if the discomfort everyone felt wasn't caused by anger at all? What if the person he spent years struggling to understand had been fighting battles nobody around them could see? Those questions became impossible to ignore when details about her private life began emerging. Suddenly, stories that once sounded like stubbornness started sounding like loneliness. Behaviors that once looked deliberate started looking defensive. The emotional wall that frustrated Ron for so many years no longer seemed designed to keep people out. It seemed designed to protect someone who had spent much of her life keeping herself isolated from the world. That realization didn't erase Ron's experiences. It didn't magically transform uncomfortable memories into pleasant ones. But it changed the story. And when the story changes, so does everything attached to it. The most surprising part wasn't the apology itself. It was what the apology revealed. According to later accounts, Frances Bavier acknowledged that she had been difficult. She acknowledged that relationships on the show could have been better. She acknowledged that much of the tension had been real. For Andy Griffith, those words brought closure. For Ron Howard, they brought clarity. Suddenly, years of unanswered questions began fitting together. The mystery he had carried since childhood no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a tragedy. Because the more Ron reflected on it, the more he realized that everyone had lost something. The cast lost the opportunity to build deeper friendships. The production lost the sense of unity it could have had. And the woman at the center of the conflict lost the chance to experience the kind of connection that existed naturally among the others. That's what made the story so different from a typical Hollywood feud. Most feuds are driven by ego, jealousy, money, or power. This one seemed driven by something far sadder. Isolation. The more Ron thought about it, the more he recognized that nobody had really won. There were no victors. No villains. Just people who spent years misunderstanding each other. Looking back, he could see why the situation had frustrated him so deeply as a child. Children crave connection. They want approval. They want warmth. They want consistency. The absence of those things leaves a mark. Yet adulthood allowed him to see what childhood couldn't. The person who seemed hardest to connect with may have been struggling the most. And that possibility transformed the entire emotional weight of the story. Suddenly, the person Ron once viewed as the source of the problem looked more like someone trapped inside a problem they couldn't escape. Ironically, that experience may have shaped Ron Howard's career more than he realized. Throughout Hollywood, he developed a reputation that was almost the complete opposite of the atmosphere he remembered from those difficult years. Actors praised him for making sets feel comfortable. Crew members praised his professionalism. Studios trusted him because he could manage personalities without creating drama. Again and again, people who worked with Howard described the same qualities: patience, empathy, communication, and emotional intelligence. Those traits didn't appear by accident. Some came from positive role models like Andy Griffith. But some came from witnessing what happens when communication breaks down completely. Ron understood firsthand how tension can spread through an environment. He understood how one strained relationship can affect dozens of people. Most importantly, he understood how dangerous assumptions can become when nobody talks openly about what they're feeling. In many ways, the mystery that haunted his childhood became one of his greatest lessons. It taught him to look deeper. It taught him to question first impressions. It taught him that difficult behavior often has deeper causes. And perhaps that's why, even decades later, he rarely spoke about the situation with bitterness. The child who experienced the tension had grown into an adult capable of understanding it. Not approving of it. Understanding it. There's a difference. Understanding doesn't erase pain. But it does provide context. And context was something Ron finally had after years of lacking it. For the first time, he could see the complete picture rather than just the part he lived through as a boy. Yet the most powerful lesson wasn't about Frances Bavier at all. It was about perception. Millions of viewers watched the Andy Griffith Show believing they understood the people who brought Mayberry to life. They thought they knew who was kind, who was warm, who was difficult, who was loved. But the truth proved far more complicated. Behind television's happiest town existed misunderstandings, disappointments, frustrations, and private struggles that audiences never saw. Ron Howard learned that lesson earlier than most. As a child, he experienced the gap between appearance and reality firsthand. As an adult, he learned that reality itself was more complicated than he originally believed. The person he once resented became someone he ultimately understood. The mystery that frustrated him for years became a story of loneliness and regret. And the conflict that seemed impossible to resolve eventually found a measure of peace. Looking back, Ron's journey through Mayberry wasn't simply the story of a child actor growing up on a hit television show. It was the story of learning how complicated people truly are. Learning that every relationship has multiple sides. Learning that even painful experiences can reveal valuable truths years later. And perhaps most importantly, learning that sometimes the people who seem hardest to love are carrying burdens nobody else can see. The audience remembered Aunt B. Ron Howard remembered the person behind Aunt B. And the difference between those two memories became one of the most fascinating hidden stories in television history.